How to Train Your Murs. Written by JUBE514 and SalParadiseLost. Read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 3. This chapter is written by SalParadiseLost. As a heads up, this chapter does include discussions of reproduction. It's pretty scientific, but it does include discussions of reproductive organs if that does make you uncomfortable, so just a heads up. Alright, now onto the fic.
How long are we supposed to keep doing this?
Clark asked as he sat next to Arthur on a bench. It faced Bruce's isotank, and he could see the angry mur churning inside of it, and the bright flash of yellow as the tips of his fins brushed against the window. It had been 4 months since they separated Bruce from his pup, and he was more chaotic than ever. He had been taken off exhibit and put into the isotank. The tank remained locked, except for the 2 times a day that they opened the food slat, and once a week they removed Bruce to clean the inside. It was a cruel setup, but one that Luther could justify due to safety concerns. In the public's eyes, Bruce was the mur who killed and ate a baby. He shouldn't be trusted around trainers or his own kid. He was a monster. Except Bruce didn't act like a monster. He acted like any animal that was scared, and had just had his entire life changed suddenly. He wouldn't know why he had been put into permanent isolation. He didn't know why they weren't bringing his baby back anymore. He didn't know why no one would interact with him. Everything was different for him, and it was asking too much of an animal to suddenly be okay with having everything taken away. Clark and Diana had kept pushing for Bruce to be exposed to Dick in some way. They proposed putting them in adjacent aquariums, separated but at least still visible to each other. They proposed doing controlled interactions on land, where they could touch each other but be slow enough for the trainers to intervene if need be. They had even proposed housing them in nearby exhibits, so they could at least call to each other. But Luther shot down every single proposal, citing that any interaction between pup and an aggressive older male could cause undue stress upon the pup. Undue stress and exposure to violent behavior have been shown to be linked to physiological symptoms such as fin tearing, abnormal swimming patterns, and weakened immune systems by the Drake Aquarium. Given that the pup is already in a delicate state, and a large investment for the aquarium, I believe it is in his best interest to remain separated from the proven aggressor. Which was the biggest load of bullshit that Clark had ever seen, but apparently as good as law when the speaker controlled nearly every aspect of their employment. Clark and Diana had tried their best to get around it, though. Diana would sometimes, completely accidentally, let Arthur bring in an overexcited pup to see his father. When the weekly tank cleaning came, Clark always sat next to the dripping wet Bruce and showed the mur videos of Dick that Arthur and Hal had sent him. It took a couple of tries before Bruce actually realized what the videos were, but once he did, he became absolutely desperate for them. He would search for Clark the moment he was taken out of the isotank, and would paw at Clark's phone while making a coo in the back of his throat that Clark recognized as his Dick sound. He wouldn't let up until Clark began showing him the videos of his pup. It was the only time in the 4 months that Clark had even seen Bruce relax, when he was watching videos of his guppy and looking like he was about to start crying because of it. It wrenched at Clark's heart to see it, but he was glad he was able to provide the father at least some relief.
Diana said something about maybe trying to do a soft release back into his main exhibit soon,
Arthur said, picking through his lunch.
They have completed the work on modifying one of the nursery exhibits for Dick, so once he's moved over there, they can put Bruce back into the main exhibit.
Smack. Bruce's great tail fin hammered against the top of the aquarium. The top rattled, but the lock stayed fastened. They had to upgrade it. Bruce had already broken the older fasteners twice this month, and he seemed set to try and do it to this set too.
How's Dick?
Clark asked, turning towards his own sandwich.
I haven't really gotten a chance to see him since I was assigned to only Bruce's care.
After the egg incident, Diana had split the mur keepers up into 2 teams, one assigned to Bruce and one assigned to Dick. Clark and Diana cared for Bruce, and Arthur and Hal took care of Dick. Diana was the only one allowed to switch between the teams, because they were trying to limit any possible cross-contamination between the Murs. They had already had an entire mess of Bruce nearly biting off one of Hal's hands, because he smelled Dick's blood on them. Hal had just come from bandaging the pup's tail, due to a minor cut in some coral.
He's...
Arthur's voice softened, and the man's huge shoulders rolled forward.
He's sad all the time. He doesn't play anymore. He hardly even eats. The only thing he does is float near the top of the tank and make keening sounds until someone comes to help him. I don't think he realizes that he's not going to be returned to Bruce. He keeps trying to escape out of his exhibit and doing the uppies signal to be picked up, even though he's gotten too heavy for anyone to hold him.
Arthur shook his head and sighed heavily.
It's damn heartbreaking.
Smack.
I think Diana might be thinking of transferring him or Bruce out,
Arthur continued.
She was talking to some experts in the field, and they suggested trying to integrate Dick into a new pod, or even release him into the wild while he's still young enough. Luther hates the idea, of course, but it's not exactly like we got the money to build the exhibit expansion like we had been planning, and Dick is growing at an insane rate. He's already getting to be almost 200 pounds. He'll be full grown before we know it. We only have room for one adult Mur, and what we have going obviously isn't going to keep working.
They both looked towards the ISO tank and the desperate Mur inside. Bruce had switched from pounding against the walls with his tail to trying to push up against the top with his shoulders.
He hates that tank,
Arthur commented idly, watching as a couple of Bruce's fingers poked through the half-inch wide crack at the top that he could only get open if he pushed against it. The pale fingers scraped around the fasteners, clumsily trying to work the lock, before Bruce lost strength and had to dip back into the water. Then, almost immediately, he was trying again.
Can you blame him?
Clark said, unwrapping his lunch.
It's not exactly designed to be comforting or long-term.
Really? It was only meant to house sick animals or to isolate newcomers and give them a lower-stakes trial period before being put out on exhibit. It was never supposed to be a home, and yet Bruce had lived there for 4 months. He might continue to live there for longer. Smack. Bruce had returned to pounding against the glass.
I'll compliment his tenacity. He doesn't quit trying to get out.
Clark shrugged.
Honestly, I think I'd be doing the same. It's not like he has anything else to do.
Over them, the clock chimed, signaling that it was 1 and their lunch break had ended. They both stood up and turned to go back to the staff room, so they could receive their next set of duties. Behind them, Bruce kept smacking his tail on the glass, but the sound was so common now, Clark had learned to ignore it, even though it broke his heart. Within a week, Arthur's prediction on Luther's plans for Bruce's soft release back into the main exhibit proved true. Dick was scheduled to be moved from the main Mur exhibit to his permanent home in the nursery section on the other side of the aquarium, and Clark was called in to help. It had been 3 years since Dick was found in the aquarium, but Mur pups grew at an astonishing rate. He was only 3, maybe 4 years old at most, but he already looked like he was 10 and was weighing in at just about 200 pounds. Clark could still carry him if he tried, but today they were doing the transfer on a modified gurney. Clark stepped into the main exhibit tank and took in a deep breath of the familiar smell. It had been months since he had been in here, and he hadn't even realized how much he missed it until he was back again. Hal and Arthur had already netted Dick and trapped the pup in a small circle of space in the shallows of the tank. It was too shallow for him to swim properly, or get enough momentum to jump over the net. Clark kept seeing the flash of his bright blue and black tail, popping up from the water as he tried to escape, and his nervous chirps as he realized the water was getting shallower. The trainers were slowly pinning him in, trying to force him to beach himself so they could get him up on the gurney. The pup seemed to be having none of it. His anxious chirps were quickly turning into frustrated growls as his escape attempts were blocked. He snarled, baring his teeth, and Clark saw the pup focusing on Arthur's hand, coiling his body, preparing to lunge.
"Dick!"
Clark shouted, instantly catching the pup's attention. The Mur's head snapped towards him, his glare lightening as he saw Clark. It had been months since they had seen each other, but thankfully he didn't seem as aggressive towards Clark. After all, Clark had always been one of the main people to bring the pup back to his father after being separated. He had spent hours holding the pup, listening to Dick's gentle chirps, and rocking the puppy in his arms under Bruce's watchful eyes. There had been a time when Dick adored him, though the continued separations had definitely put a strain on their relationship. Clark stepped into the beach area, padding across the sand and right up to the Mur.
"Whoa, Clark, watch out,"
Hal muttered, and Dick gave him a short growl.
"He's okay,"
Clark whispered.
"He's just a little scared."
Dick snarled as Clark approached, flashing fangs and spreading fins to make himself look bigger. His eel-like tail thrashed in the shallow water, thumping wetly on the sandy bottom. He kept arching his back, but didn't lunge as Clark drew close and crouched down.
"Hey, baby,"
he cooed, and watched as Dick's facade began to break apart. He couldn't keep the snarl, and Clark was beginning to watch his bottom lip quiver.
"Someone want to go back to Dad?"
Dick's face went hopeful, and he chirped, throwing himself at Clark. He whined, young and plaintive, in Clark's ear, clutching onto Clark's shirt and trying to shove himself into his arms.
"Up we go,"
Clark groaned, lifting the 200-plus pounds baby and adjusting his squirmy body. Dick instantly threw his arms around Clark's neck and curled that long, dexterous tail around Clark's waist. God, he was getting heavy. Clark was definitely going to have to keep up with his weight training if he was going to want to keep this going for a few more years. Dick keened a little and pressed his head right into the crook of Clark's neck. His quivering little nose tickled.
"I'll bring him to his new home. You two focus on getting the tank ready for Bruce, okay?"
Arthur hummed.
"You're taking him straight to his exhibit, right? No other stops?"
Clark chuckled and adjusted the kid in his arms.
"Maybe hold off from going to fetch Bruce for a couple of hours?"
They both laughed and began to take up the net.
"Sure, Clark. We'll text you as late as possible."
Clark patted Dick's back and began taking him to see his dad. What Luther didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Eventually, they did have to put Dick into his tank and move Bruce back into the large exhibit. The transfer went as well as he could hope, though. Bruce was grumpy about not having Dick for longer. Clark stared into the main Mur tank, a frown on his face. It was after hours, but before they had settled everything down for the night. This was always Clark's favorite time. In front of him, Bruce's aquarium swayed peacefully. The small schools of enrichment fish, i.e. snacks for the Murs, raced through the seaweed and the coral. The artificial current swayed the long tendrils of the kelp bed they had in the back of the tank. Every once in a while, the kelp leaves shook violently, and Clark could see the flash of dark fins. Bruce was hidden in the kelp bed somewhere, doing something that the aquarium and the public couldn't see. His tail or long dorsal fins would occasionally flick into view, but most of the time, he stayed almost completely hidden. It was just another odd behavior to add to the list of strange things Bruce did these days. He was slower than normal, and he had a sudden new interest in the kelp bed. He hadn't made any escape attempts, even though it made it clear that he was not happy that Dick was in a second tank. He stayed close to the bottom of the tank, even though he had used to swim its entire length. It seemed like depression to Clark, which Clark couldn't even blame Bruce for. He was sure that he'd also be depressed if he was trapped in a glass prison, separated from his kid, stared at for nearly the entire day, and put into solitary confinement when he acted up. He sighed, and was just about to move away when he realized that there was something staring at him. He was blinking at Clark, from between the long strands of the kelp. He was pale and had a round, chubby-cheeked baby face, with a spray of freckles that dotted the bridge of his nose. 2 cranial fins flared out from around his ears and twitched occasionally, reminding Clark of a perked-up dog. He tilted his head in curiosity, and Clark got a glimpse of his red, black, and white-striped tail before he suddenly turned around and disappeared back into the kelp. Clark couldn't move. He could hardly breathe because that had been a merpup, and it definitely wasn't Dick. He couldn't take his eyes from the gently swaying kelp. Bruce? He hadn't eaten the egg. Clark turned on his heel and rushed up the stairs towards the staff room. When he burst in, he startled Diana, who was bent over what looked like financial forms with Hal. "He didn't eat the egg!" They looked at him like he was crazy. "He didn't eat the egg. I swear, I saw the pup in the main mer tank." "Clark," Diana said slowly, and with a gentleness that bothered him. "There's lots of fish in the main mer exhibit. I'm sure they look a lot like little mers when you're really tired." "I'm not tired. There's a small mer in the tank. Come look." Hal met Diana's eyes and raised an eyebrow. The silent look clearly said, "Let's just humor him," and it made Diana sigh. She gracefully stood up. "Come on, show me what you saw." "Arthur, get in a wetsuit and sweep the tank. I want every corner checked, every piece of coral turned over," Diana ordered, putting on her wetsuit. "Clark," she barked, rounding on him. "Keep Bruce out of the water. I don't want him slipping in when we're down here." Clark, who was standing next to a recently pulled from the water Bruce, startled and nodded quickly. "Yeah, I got him," he said, even though Bruce wasn't exactly fighting to get back into the water. He was annoyed, of course. Who wouldn't be after being pulled from their comfortable place and then shoved onto a surface they couldn't really move on? But the mer didn't resist being manhandled. He had actually rather willingly let himself be taken from the water and sequestered off into his little beach area. He had hissed at them and made short little huffs in the back of his throat, which Clark easily recognized as his "your behavior is exhausting me" sound. But once situated comfortably on the beach, he just relaxed. He was leaning his head onto one of his palms, his hair dripping into his face, and his fins flopping like wet blankets all around him. His tail was partially curled, and he sporadically twitched his fluke, spraying the sand. The image put together made him look slightly like an exasperated wet cat. Bruce silently watched as his trainers scoured his home, idly following their movements with his eyes. He didn't seem concerned about them finding the pup at all. Actually, if Clark had to put a finger on it, he would say that Bruce looked a little smug. Clark's face turned to his friends, and he also watched as they valiantly tried to search for the pup. Then he sat, settling down next to Bruce. The mer didn't move. He only kept watching with that slightly amused glint to his eyes. "They're not going to find the pup, are they?" Clark asked, even though he knew the mer couldn't understand. Clark, of course, didn't get an answer. Bruce was kept waiting until, eventually, he was cleared to return to the water. Diana practically growled as she smacked the table, rustling the 3 pictures they had of what they think might be the pup. That's right, only 3. They had been searching at every opportunity they got for 2 months, and the only thing they had to show for it was 3 pictures of red smudges that they think might be Bruce's second baby. No one, outside of Clark, Diana, and Hal, on that first day, had even seen the pup. He was like a ghost, visiting one day before disappearing to never be seen again for an entire week. On the bright side, now that it was clear that Bruce hadn't eaten the egg, well, they were like 70% sure of it. Dick had been approved to be moved back into the main tank with Bruce. It was honestly the happiest Clark had seen the mers in a while. It was like a new life had been breathed back into the tank. Dick was energetic again, zipping through the exhibit and happily battling against his enrichment toys. He could usually be found trying to gnaw through one of the rubber cages to try to get the treats inside, or trying to figure out a new puzzle toy to unlock a sparkling, shiny bauble. He was much more hesitant around trainers than he had been in the past, but he still could be lured into play if the trainers kept their distance. On the not-so-bright side, Luther was pulling his fictional hair out, trying to find the pup, and yelling at them almost every single day to figure out where it went and how it got there. The thing was, they were no closer to figuring out the mystery of how their little pup just popped into existence. Okay, back to the drawing board, Diana muttered, bringing the MERS team's attention back to her. There are basically two main theories. Bruce ate the egg, and this pup is from a different egg he produced later, or he somehow managed to hide the egg, bring it to hatching, and also hide the pup after it's hatching right under our noses. She turned back to the main whiteboard they had in the conference room. Their two theories were written out, along with various other ones that had been thrown out during their investigation. Along with the theories, the team had posted up images of MER anatomy, drawings of their skeletal structures, x-rays of various specimens, and diagrams of their organ systems. A picture of Bruce, laying still on a laboratory table, and faced in the forced relaxation of anesthesia, took up the center of the board, and post-it notes of their ideas surrounded it. Diana glared at the image, as if blaming it for the mystery before them. "How the hell did you manage to have pups?" she muttered.
"This might be a dumb idea,"
Hal said, flipping through a couple of pages of their collected notes.
"But are we 100% sure that Bruce is male? That could sort of explain how he, maybe she, is popping out pups."
Diana snorted and took a picture from a file and slapped it in front of Hal. He yelped, and when Clark looked over, and yep, it was Bruce's penis, fully extended and pushed up against a ruler by a pair of gloved hands.
"Damn," Arthur huffed. "Lucky mermaids."
Okay, Hal stammered through a blush as he flipped the photo over.
"He's obviously male. You've made your point." "Could he be both?"
Arthur mused, sliding the picture to himself and looking at it again.
"Ovotestes have been found in sharks, and it's not completely out of line to think he could be both or possibly have the ability to switch between sexes. There are fish species that are known to undergo sex changes."
"I checked that too," Diana admitted. "After Dick made himself known, I personally made sure we didn't have a secret female. I also checked with the veterinarian. He simply doesn't have the parts. He doesn't have any signs that he could have the parts. If he could switch, then the body would show some evidence of that." Diana took the photo back from Arthur and returned it to a folder. On top of that, MERS seemed to function the same as humans in terms of sexual dimorphism, and there haven't been documented cases of MERS undergoing a natural, unprompted sex change.
"So, in short,"
Clark said to summarize,
"he's definitely male and has been male, and there's no evidence of him producing eggs. Which makes sense, because all the research anyways confirms that MER reproduction is obtained through the internal insemination of an ovoviparous egg."
Diana nodded, and Hal huffed.
"Can I get that last part in English for the people who didn't go to a fancy university and get a degree in marine biology?"
Clark chuckled and began speaking.
"Generally, there are two main methods of reproduction for animals: viviparity or oviparity. Viviparous animals give birth to live young, and the embryo is nourished through contact with the mother. Humans do this through a placenta, and it's generally how most mammals reproduce. Oviparous animals like birds, reptiles, and fish, though, lay external eggs, which develop outside the mother's body. Ovoviparous animals are the hybrid. The mother typically develops eggs that stay inside her body until internal hatching and give birth to live young. Sharks are one of the animals that reproduce ovovipariously, and research has shown a lot of similarity between sharks and MERS in that regard. The eggs produced by both of them are very similar, and to our knowledge, MERS follow roughly the same reproductive patterns as sharks. Females produce an internal unfertilized egg, which a male inseminates, and the egg grows within the female. The problem comes in that, for some reason, the female MERS will reject the eggs at a point. We don't know why, but they never take the eggs to full development. They incubate them for about a month, but then they lay the egg and ignore it. That's why all MER eggs die. They are rejected from the mother's body before they are fully developed, and they die from exposure.
Hal frowned, his eyebrow creased.
So the mothers just kill their kids?
Diana winced and shook her head. I wouldn't say that they purposefully kill their pups. That's anthropomorphizing them a bit too much, I think. Every single breeding attempt has ended up this way, so it's safer to assume that this is a natural process, or it's due to an aquarium not being able to provide them the resources to take the eggs to full development. Plus, she gave a little smirk. Hal, I know that Sheila was the only MER you've interacted with, right? She was very sweet, but she was by far an outlier for most female MERS. Most females are highly aggressive and independent. Many aquariums will refuse to stock them due to safety concerns. They aren't exactly what I would call motherly, even on their most gracious of days.
Arthur laughed. You can say that again. One girl nearly tore my arm off when I was doing my internship at the Georgia Aquarium. I was trying to take measurements of her fins, and then she whipped around and barely missed getting her fangs into my bicep.
Damn, Hal whispered.
So Bruce definitely isn't a Brucette then.
Arthur choked a little bit.
Brucette? That's the stupidest name I've ever heard.
Well, will you tell me what the female version of a Bruce is? Hal squawked.
I don't know, but it's definitely not Brucette.
Arthur and Hal bickered until Diana cut them off with a cough. Boy, you're both dumb. So, can we get back to the problem at hand?
Sorry, Dee.
They muttered in unison, hanging their heads like misbehaved dogs.
What do we know about how males are as fathers?
Clark asked, motioning for an anatomy diagram of a male MER to be passed to him. The diagram showed a male MER's skeletal structure on the left side and his organs on the right. Clark knew that male and female skeletons were generally the same, and varied more so due to their breeds than their sex. The organs had more differences, though. All MERs had a mix of human and Piscean organs, most notably the unique to the species gill and lung combination. They had human-resembling livers, hearts, and spinal cords, but their kidneys were much more complex, to deal with water salinity and match the transition between saltwater, freshwater, and air. Females and males both had internal sex organs, with most features hidden in a MER's sheath, and virtually unseeable by the normal viewer. Males also had the interesting quirk of having 2 swim bladders and enlarged kidneys, presumably to deal with regulating the typically larger body size. Not much, Diana admitted with a sigh. Males seem happy enough to form pods together, but females are independent and will often attack males randomly. Because of that, aquariums tend to keep the sexes apart, and any breeding is done through artificial insemination. There have been some documented cases of males being housed with females successfully, but no co-populations resulted from those groups. To be quite honest, a male's relationship with his young has been largely unstudied because aquariums haven't put them and the pups together due to safety concerns. Bruce is obviously attached to his pup, but we don't know whether he is the norm or an exception to the rule. Diana turned back towards the photo of Bruce, tapping her finger against her chin. There's so many unknowns when it comes to pups, and if an aquarium has a pup, it's too valuable to risk those unknowns. MERS themselves are rare, but wild catching a pup is basically unheard of. They're wildly popular to the public, though, and are cash cows to the aquariums that do have them. Part of the reason that information on MER reproduction is so scant is because most aquariums are vying to be the first to captive breed.
Because whoever will be the first captive breed will control the supply,
Arthur said, putting the pieces together.
They would be the only real supplier of MER pups, and they could ask almost any price they want.
Arthur's frown deepened and scowled at the wood grain of the conference table.
That's why Luther is pushing us to figure out how Bruce is keeping the pups alive. He thinks armor is a key to taking hold of the merpup economy.
Yes, that's what I suspect too. Diana agreed with a disgusted tilt to her lip. I highly doubt all his pressure is on us due to purely scientific interests.
That has to raise animal welfare concerns, though,
Clark said, cutting in.
An entire industry based upon breeding and selling pups? What about the parents? Bruce is highly distressed when he's separated from Dick, even after a couple of hours. I couldn't imagine taking Dick away from him forever.
I know, Clark, I know. I don't like it either. Mers are smart. Just at least as smart as dolphins, no matter what those idiots at the Drake Aquarium say. That's why I want us to be the first. So we have a chance to mitigate the damage and get a say in how this happens. Diana met his eyes, and she swept her gaze around the room, looking at all of them. I went into marine biology because I wanted to help animals. I want to figure this out first, so we can help control how much harm comes to these beautiful creatures. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Author's notes. This chapter was brought to you today by my science degree I never got to use. I hope my alma mater is proud that I'm using all their animal behavior classes to write fictional animal species. And reader's notes for me. I was not expecting to have to read about reproduction biology. That was a little bit, that took a little bit to get out. And I am now remembering there is more related to that later in this series. Yeah, that's going to come up a bit. So if you are uncomfortable, I'm going to let you know that will come up a bit. I'll try and remember to do, I'll try and remember to add trigger warnings if this does trigger anyone. Yeah, so I know there's definitely something later that will have a trigger warning, and I'll make sure to keep that there. But yeah, what are your guys' opinions on, like, Jason actually being here? Ooh, Jason! Yeah, Jason and Dick is back with Bruce, finally! I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like a lot happens in each chapter. It feels like quite a bit of story and plot is made in each chapter. And I kind of like that. It's kind of nice. And it's nice for you guys, because you get like a nice, decently fleshed out chapter each time I update this, which is like every 2 weeks or so. Anyways, thank you guys for listening, and bye!